Antarctica, February 1947. At minus 70 degrees Fahrenheit, 13 Navy SEALs vanished into a crevasse that sealed itself shut, with their blood still steaming on the ice. I am the War Maestro, and tonight, I exhume the classified terrors of Operation Highjump, where America's largest Antarctic expedition awakened something ancient that still haunts military frequencies to this day. The largest naval deployment to Antarctica began not with fanfare, but with secrecy. Operation Highjump, 13 warships, 33 aircraft, 4,700 military personnel executed, with the urgency of a wartime invasion rather than a peacetime expedition. Admiral Richard E. Byrd, America's most decorated polar explorer, personally selected the men for what the classified documents called condition preparation in event of polar defense necessity. Defense against what? No one dared to ask. Lieutenant Elias Rourke's fingers trembled as he unsealed his orders aboard the USS Philippine Sea. Not from the knife-edge cold that had already claimed 3 men's fingers to frostbite, but from what the top-secret documents revealed. Aerial reconnaissance of grid coordinates deliberately omitted from every published Antarctic map. A handwritten note in Admiral Byrd's distinctive script warned, "Maintain radio silence if you encounter Structure A. Under no circumstances, land or investigate without direct authorization. Previous team did not return. Previous team." The words crawled across Rourke's skin like ice spiders. The Martin PBM Mariner's engines screamed against the polar wind as Rourke guided the aircraft over the most desolate landscape on Earth. Beside him, Lieutenant Coleman monitored radio frequencies with uncharacteristic intensity. 3 other reconnaissance flights had already disappeared without distress calls. "Sir," Coleman's voice cracked, his face drained of color. Radio's picking up Jesus Christitz Kowalski's voice. "Lieutenant Kowalski, missing for 6 days with his entire crew, beneath the ice. They're watching us through the ice. Don't let them touch you." Static consumed the transmission except for the sound of something wet, and Viscerala Man being turned inside out. Coleman ripped off his headset, blood trickling from his left ear. That broadcast, according to the timestamp, it's transmitting from 3 days in the future. Impossible, Rourke muttered. But the word died as the vast whiteness below suddenly revealed what the aerial photographs had missed: massive angular structures jutting from the ice like obsidian teeth, arranged in geometric patterns that violated natural law. Metal glinted, too perfectly preserved for structures allegedly abandoned since 1939. "German base 211, Coleman whispered. The rumors were. The compass exploded in a shower of glass as the plane's instruments convulsed. The horizon tilted sickeningly as something massive moved beneath the ice, something that left a shadow larger than their aircraft. The radio crackled to life without Coleman touching it. Admiral Byrd's voice, impossibly calm. "Lieutenant Rourke, this is a direct order. Return to ship immediately. We've lost contact with Base Camp 3. All 17 men, just gone." Through the static, a second voice overlapped Byrd speaking perfect German in a transmission timestamp from 1939. "We have awakened it. It's not ice. It just wears a mask of ice." As the plane banked sharply away, Rourke glimpsed movement near the structuresmen in outdated Wehrmacht uniforms, perfectly preserved despite the cold, walking in formation. Their faces turned upward in unison, revealing empty eye sockets filled with squirming darkness. Rourke's aircraft touched down on the USS Philippine Sea's deck with ice encrusting its wings in patterns that resembled handprints. The debriefing lasted 5 hours. Admiral Byrd personally reviewed every photograph, every instrument reading, scrutinizing them with an intensity that bordered on desperation. "Did you hear the voices yourself, Lieutenant?" Byrd asked, his weathered face betraying nothing. "Yes, sir, in German, and something else." Rourke hesitated. How could he explain the sensation that crept through his mind when the transmission came through? The feeling of something ancient pressing against his thoughts, like frozen fingers probing for entry. Byrd slid a folder across the table, insignia of the SS Ahnenerbe stamped on its cover. "Operation Valkyrie II, he said quietly. In 38, Hitler sent an expedition here, led by Captain Wilhelm Landig. Their mission was archaeological in nature. They were searching for something they called the entrance. The photographs inside showed excavations in the icy tunnels carved with mechanical precision, walls marked with symbols that matched what Rourke had seen from the air. They disappeared in 39, Byrd continued. All of them. Their last transmission mentioned awakening something that could win the war for Germany. The door opened and Dr. Schaefer entered, eyes downcast. "Show him," Byrd ordered. Schaefer unrolled a map marked with coordinates that matched exactly where Rourke had seen the structures. "I was the only survivor," he whispered. "I escaped because I refused to go below. The others, they found chambers under the ice, perfectly preserved, not built by any human civilization." Byrd's expression hardened. "Base Camp 3 went silent 3 hours ago. 17 men. Our radio operator received one transmission before the line went dead." He pressed a button on a recording device. A voice emerged, breathless with terror. "Something's moving outside the tents. Jesus Christ, it looks like. Oh God, it looks like Schmidt. Schmidt's been dead for 2 days. It's wearing his..." And dissolved into static, punctuated by what might have been screams. "Schmidt was found frozen to death during a routine patrol," Byrd explained. "His body was being stored for transport home. We're sending a rescue team at first light," Captain Harrison announced, entering with a list of names. "Lieutenant Rourke will lead the operation." That night, as the Antarctic darkness pressed against his cabin window, Rourke dreamed of ice that whispered his name. He saw tunnels stretching downward, carved not by tools but by something that moved through solid matter, like a shark through water. At the bottom waited a chamber where German soldiers sat perfectly preserved around a table, their frozen faces locked in expressions of transcendent horror. In his dream, one turned to look at him. Its eyes were mirrors, reflecting Rourke's own face, but older, withered, as if he'd been trapped in the ice for decades. "They only show you what you fear," the corpse whispered. Rourke awoke to find frost coating the inside of his cabin, arranged in patterns that resembled the symbols from the Nazi excavation photographs. And on his mirror, written in condensation that shouldn't have been possible in the bone-dry Antarctic air, "We're waiting for you." The handwriting was his own. The rescue team assembled at dawn 6 men, including Rourke, each one selected for their combat experience and cold weather training. They loaded the M-29 Weasel-tracked vehicle with supplies, weapons, and communication equipment. No one mentioned the strange silence that had descended over the fleet, or how the radios picked up phantom transmissions, fragments of conversations between men who were either dead or missing. 30 miles to Base Camp 3, Rourke told his team as they departed. "We maintain constant radio contact with the ship. Any anomalous activity, we report immediately." The Antarctic landscape stretched before them, a white void where distance and perspective played tricks on the mind. The temperature hovered at -58 degrees Fahrenheit. Each breath crystallized instantly, each exhalation a reminder of how quickly life could freeze here. 5 hours into their journey, the radio operator, Petty Officer Jenkins, removed his headset with trembling hands. "Sir," he whispered, "someone's broadcasting on our frequency. They're reading off our names, in order of date of birth." He passed the headset to Rourke. Through the static, a voice that might have been human recited, "Lieutenant Elias James Rourke, born the 17th of April, 1917, followed by details of his life that weren't in any military file, his childhood fear of drowning, the name of his first love, the recurring nightmare that had plagued him since the war. "Shut it off," Rourke ordered, his mouth dry. 3 miles from Base Camp 3, they found the dogs. 8 huskies wandering aimlessly across the ice, their bodies emaciated, as if they'd been without food for weeks, though they'd been missing only 18 hours. Their fur was white with frost, yet they were alive, impossibly alive, in temperatures that should have killed them overnight. "Jesus," Corporal Diaz muttered, approaching one. "Look at their eyes." The dog's eyes reflected nothing not light, not the men surrounding them. They stared through the rescue team, fixing on something distant and unseen. When Diaz touched one, his glove froze solid to its fur. He screamed as crystalline patterns spread up his arm like living frost, branching across his sleeve. The dog didn't react, not even when Sergeant Miller drew his sidearm and shot it. The bullet passed through without blood or impact, as if the animal was already a ghost. The Weasel's engine died next, its metal components suddenly brittle with cold. The radio followed, its tubes shattering one by one. In the silence that followed, they all heard a low vibration coming from beneath them, like massive machinery operating deep below the ice. There, Miller pointed toward a distant ridge. Base Camp 3 came into view, tents still standing, equipment undisturbed. No signs of struggle or evacuation. The American flag hung limply above it, preserved in the windless cold. And surrounding the camp in a perfect circle, 17 pairs of boots, each filled with frozen feet broken off at the ankles. The rest of the bodies were gone. They dragged themselves away, Diaz whispered, pointing to trails of blood that led toward a massive crevasse that hadn't appeared on any map or aerial survey. Rourke knelt beside one of the trails. The blood hadn't frozen. It remained liquid despite the impossible cold, and as he watched, it slowly crawled through the snow like a living thing, heading toward the crevasse. From the darkness of the rift came a sound no human throat could make, the creaking of massive hinges opening after centuries of disuse. "We should return to the ship," Jenkins said, his voice cracking. "Report what we've found." Rourke stared at the crevasse. Military protocol demanded they retreat and request reinforcements. But 17 men were missing men under Byrd's command, men like him with families waiting back home. And there was something else, a compulsion that tugged at his mind like a fishhook. "Diaz, Jenkins, stay topside with the comm equipment. Miller, Thompson, Hayes, you're with me." Rourke checked his Colt M1911, though he doubted bullets would help against whatever had taken those men. They anchored ropes at the edge of the crevasse. The descent took 12 minutes, the temperature dropping with each foot. At -65, the flashlight batteries began to fail. At -70, Hayes' chronometer stopped, its mechanism seized by cold that shouldn't have been physically possible. "Sir," Miller whispered, "the walls." Their remaining light revealed what the darkness had hidden. The crevasse wasn't natural. Its walls were smooth, polished to a mere finish that reflected their faces with perfect clarity. But the reflections weren't synchronized with their movements. They lagged behind, sometimes stopping to watch the men with expressions that didn't match their originals. Thompson began to hyperventilate. "My reflection," he gasped. "It's not me. It's someone's inside the ice, wearing my face." Before Rourke could respond, a metallic gleam caught his eye. 20 feet away, half emerged from the wall, a German U-boat, its hull impossibly preserved, Nazi insignia still visible on its conning tower. "Impossible," Miller breathed. "We're miles inland, hundreds of feet above sea level." As they approached, Rourke saw the U-boat's hatch was open. Boot prints led away from it, fresh prints in the frost that coated the crevasse floor. "All -731, Thompson read from the submarine's hull. "Sir, this boat was reported lost in the Atlantic in 1942, nowhere near Antarctica." Inside the U-boat's control room, the scene defied explanation. The instruments remained intact, logbooks open on the chart table. A half-played chess game sat abandoned. Coffee cups still held liquid that hadn't frozen despite the cold. The last log entry, dated the 11th of February, 1942, read, "Impossible depths. The pressure should have crushed us. The ice speaks now. It makes promises. God forgive us for listening." A photograph was pinned beside the entry showing this exact crevasse, and at its bottom, a U-boat, U-731, the same submarine they were standing in. "They knew they'd be here," Rourke whispered. 5 years ago, they already knew. Movement caught his eye, his reflection in the polished brass of a gauge panel. It smiled as he frowned, then pointed behind him. Carved into the wall of the control room, a doorway led deeper into the ice. Symbols matching those from the Anannerbe files surrounded it. At its center hung a rusted key. Thompson reached for it. "Don't." Rourke began, but too late. As Thompson's fingers touched the key, his reflection reached back through the ice and seized his wrist. The surface rippled like water as an arm identical to Thompson's, yet somehow older, withered, emerged, and pulled. Thompson screamed as he was dragged toward the wall, his body impossibly melding with the solid ice. In seconds, he was gone, absorbed completely. Only his reflection remained, staring out at them, mouth open, in a silent scream. Then all the reflections turned to look at something behind them, something approaching from the doorway, something wearing the faces of dead men. "Run!" Rourke shouted, firing his sidearm at the approaching figures. The bullets passed through them without effect, striking sparks from the U-boat's hull. They fled back through the submarine's hatch, scrambling toward their descent ropes. Hayes reached them first, hands shaking as he clipped his harness. "They're coming," Miller gasped, looking back. From the U-boat emerged not the missing men of Base Camp 3, but German sailors in weathered uniforms. Their movements were jerky, puppet-like. Their faces bore expressions of serene horrorious, wide with terror, mouths curved in unnatural smiles. As they stepped from the submarine, their bodies left trails of moisture as if they were melting. "The ice shows you your future," they said in unison. Hayes's harness suddenly snapped, the metal brittle from the cold. He plummeted 15 feet before Miller caught his rope. But the moment their hands connected, both men froze, solid, a perfect ice sculpture of human desperation. Rourke watched in horror as cracks spread across their frozen forms. Then they shattered, fragments scattering across the crevasse floor. Each piece continued to move, fingers crawling, eyes blinking within broken sections of face. The German figures were closer now. Behind them, emerging from the submarine like a perverse birth, crawled Thompson, changed, his body elongated, joints bending at impossible angles. His skin had the same glassy sheen as the crevasse walls, and within it swirled patterns that matched the symbols from the Nazi documents. "It gets inside you," Thompson said, his voice overlapping with other voices, some speaking German, some in languages Rourke couldn't identify. "It shows you things, beautiful things, terrible things. The ice remembers everything." Rourke backed away, abandoning the ropes. The only escape route now was deeper into the crevasse, through the carved doorway. He ran, pursued by the sound of Thompson's distorted laughter and the rhythmic footfalls of the German sailors. Beyond the doorway stretched a tunnel, hewn with the same mirrored precision as the crevasse. Rourke's flashlight captured glimpses of his reflection keeping pace beside him, sometimes younger, sometimes older, sometimes not human at all. The tunnel widened into a vast chamber that stole Rourke's breath. A perfect dome carved from ice, its ceiling higher than should have been possible given the terrain above. At its center stood a circular table surrounded by chairs. Some held the preserved bodies of German officers, frozen in postures of attentive listening. Others contained the missing men from Base Camp 3, their faces locked in expressions of rapturous terror. And at the head of the table sat a figure Rourke recognized from intelligence photographs, Captain Wilhelm Landig, leader of the 1938 Nazi expedition, perfectly preserved. His uniform bore the insignia of the Anannerbe division. His eyes were open, alert, living. "Lieutenant Rourke," Landig said, his German accent thick but his English perfect. "We've been expecting you since 1939. He gestured to an empty chair. "Please join us. There's someone who wishes to speak with you." A radio sat at the center of the Tablin antique German model. From its speaker came a voice Rourke knew intimately, though he'd never heard it before. It spoke to him of secrets buried in the ice, of knowledge from before history, of power that could reshape the world. It spoke with his voice as it would sound decades from now. "This is where it begins for you," Landig said softly. "This is where it began for all of us." "I don't understand," Rourke said, fighting the urge to sit at the table. Every instinct screamed to run. yet his body yearned to move forward, to join the circle of frozen men. "No one does at first," Landig replied. His uniform crackled as he moved, frost falling from fabric that should have rotted decades ago. The Americans, the Germans, the Russian Sui, all came looking for different things. A weapon, a refuge, a truth. We all found the same thing. And what was that? Rourke forced himself to ask. A mirror, a window, a door. Landig gestured around the chamber. The ice doesn't just preserve, Lieutenant. It remembers. It connects. Past, present, future all, reflected, all accessible. The radio crackled again, and Rourke's older voice continued. You think you're in 1947, but time moves differently here. I've been speaking to you for 30 years. I will speak to you for 30 more. The circle must be maintained. A movement caught Rourke's eye, a Nazi officer at the table, turning his head mechanically to stare at him. The man's chest suddenly split open like a cracked window, revealing not organs but a hollow cavity, filled with the same symbols Rourke had seen throughout the structure. From this chest cavity, a pale hand emerged, reaching toward him. They're only vessels now, Landig explained. The ice needs bodies to speak through, to show us its memories. What happened to my men? Rourke demanded. The men from Base Camp 3? They're here. They're there. They're everywhere the ice touches. Landig's face began to change as he spoke, aging decades in seconds, skin tightening over bone. Time is the first illusion to go. Space is the second. The chamber shuddered. Fractures raced across its mirrored surface, revealing glimpses of other spaces behind the icy, a Nazi bunker in Berlin, an American laboratory, a future cityscape in ruins. We thought we were building weapons, Landig continued, his voice now matching the aged rasp from the radio. The Ahnenerbe, clip scientists, all of us, but we were building a door, and when you open a door, his mouth stretched in a rictus grin. Something comes through. Rourke lunged for the radio, determined to destroy it, to break whatever connection was being formed. His fingers closed around cold metal and passed through it like smoke. You can't change what's already happened, his voice said from the speaker. I've been trying for decades. Every expedition, every warning, it always ends the same way. The cracks in the chamber walls widened. Through them, Rourke glimpsed impossible scenes himself leading other men into the same chamber in different decades, wearing different uniforms. Himself sitting at the table, eyes gleaming with the same unnatural light as Landig's. Himself speaking into radios, recording warnings that would be ignored. There's still time, Rourke said desperately. I can warn Byrd, destroy this place. Many have tried, Landig replied, standing with jerky movements. His uniform fell away, revealing skin that had the same reflective quality as the chamber walls. Ice melts, ice refreezes, ice remembers. The missing men from Base Camp 3 rose from their chairs in unison, their faces now featureless mirrors that reflected Rourke from different angles, different times. They surrounded him, arms outstretched. The door swings both ways, his voice explained from the radio. They want out, it wants in. Rourke drew his pistol and pressed it against his temple. Then I end it here. That won't work either, the radio said softly. I've tried that too. As if to demonstrate, one of the base camp men stepped forward, his reflective face suddenly resolving into Rourke's features. He raised a ghostly pistol to his temple and pulled the trigger. His head jerked, but instead of blood, mirror shards scattered across the chamber floor, each containing a miniature version of the scene being enacted. You have one chance, the radio whispered urgently. The tape recorder, in the locked room. Find it before. The transmission cut to static as the chamber began to collapse around them. The chamber imploded around Rourke, shards of mirrored ice collapsing inward like a gravity well. He ran blindly through fractured reflections of himself, past German soldiers melting into puddles that rose up to become American sailors, past equipment from expeditions that hadn't happened yet. A narrow corridor opened before him, Moni hadn't seen before, but somehow recognized. At its end stood a simple metal door with a sign in German, verboten, forbidden. Inside was a small room containing only a desk, a chair, and a man, a Nazi officer, long dead, pistols still clutched in his frozen hand. On the desk sat an ancient, reel-to-reel tape recorder, its metal housing covered in the now familiar symbols. Rourke approached cautiously. The dead officer's uniform bore the insignia of the SS Ahnenerbe Division and the name tag Dr. Heinrich Weber Schaefer's predecessor, the scientist who disappeared with Landing's expedition. A note was pinned beneath the tape recorder, the paper brittle with age, yet perfectly preserved. In precise German handwriting, "We were fools. We thought we had found the lost knowledge. It found us first." Beneath it, hurriedly scrawled, "They speak through the ice. They show you what you fear." And finally, in different handwriting American, Militaire added decades later, "We let them in." Rourke recognized the last handwriting as his own. The walls around him began to melt, revealing layers like geological stratus won a frozen moment from a different time. German expeditions, Russian explorers, earlier American missions. Future operations with equipment he didn't recognize, all ending in this room, all finding this recorder. Understanding crashed over him with cruel clarity. This wasn't just a Nazi base that had discovered something ancient. This was a trap that had been sprung countless times, an endless loop of discovery and warning and failure. With trembling hands, Rourke pressed play on the recorder. His own voice emerged from the speaker holder, ravaged by time and despair. "If you're hearing this, you're me. Again, it's the 11th of February, 1947 for you. It's been 50 years for me. Listen carefully, there's never much time. The ice preserves moments like insects in amber. It collects them, uses them. This place, this structure, isn't a Nazi base. It's older, much older. The Germans found it. We found it. Everyone who finds it becomes part of it. It feeds on discovery. On the moment of revelation when you realize what you've found, that moment stretches out here, plays on repeat, creates echoes that ripple backward and forward through time. I've been trapped in that moment for decades, watching myself find this recorder over and over. Sometimes I'm German, sometimes American, sometimes something else. The ice doesn't care. It just needs witnesses to keep the loop intact. There's only one way to break the cycle. You must." The tape degraded into static, then cleared to reveal a different voice, Weber's, the dead Nazi scientist. "We have awakened it. God help us." The room shuddered violently. Ice encroached from every surface, reaching for Rourke like grasping hands. The dead officer at the desk slowly raised his head, frost cracking across his face as it contorted into a smile. In desperate panic, Rourke seized the tape recorder and smashed it against the desk. Sparks flew as ancient vacuum tubes shattered. The temperature plummeted instantly, cold so intense it burned his lungs. The dead Nazi's mouth opened impossibly wide, dislocating with a sound like breaking glass. From it poured not words but an impossible tide of liquid ice that filled the room in seconds. Rourke's last conscious thought was a memory that hadn't happened yet of himself, decades older, recording a warning on this same tape recorder, of placing it on this desk for his younger self to find, of failing, as he always had, as he always would. On the 7th of March, 1956, 9 years after Operation Highjump was abruptly terminated, the USS Glacier picked up a faint distress signal during a routine Antarctic expedition. The transmission came on a military frequency not used since 1947. The voice was barely audible through the static. "We let them in. It's so cold, but I see now. I see." The radio man would later swear the voice identified itself as Lieutenant Elias Rourke, an officer listed as missing in action during Operation Highjump. He would also swear that after Rourke's voice faded, something else came on the line, something that breathed with the sound of cracking ice, that spoke with many voices, layered atop each other, that knew the names of everyone aboard the Glacier. The Glacier's logs show that the ship immediately reversed course and returned to port. The recording of the transmission was classified. The matter was never officially investigated. To this day, no expedition has ventured within 50 miles of the coordinates where Base Camp 3 once stood. Satellite imagery shows nothing but unbroken ice. But at certain times of year, when the Antarctic sun hangs low on the horizon, radar scans detect momentary anomalies beneath that ice, geometric patterns that shouldn't exist, structures that appear and disappear between sweeps, movements that have no explanation. The ice remembers, the ice preserves, the ice waits. If this tale from the depths of Operation Highjump has left you with a chill that even the warmest room can't thaw, take a moment to join the War Maestro's archive. Check your reflection in the mirror. First, make sure it moves when you doth and subscribe to unearth more classified horrors from history's battlefields. Hit that notification bell. You'll want to know immediately when our next military file is declassified. Some transmissions only come through once before disappearing forever. Share this account with fellow enthusiasts who understand that the most terrifying stories aren't found in fiction, but buried in redacted military reports and the trembling testimonies of veterans who've seen what lies beyond explanation. Remember, some expeditions never truly end, and somewhere in the Antarctic ice, Lieutenant Rourke is still trying to warn us.